Welcome to Book Talk. When Tony Blair stepped down as Prime Minister, he was given a standing ovation by MPs as he left the Commons chamber for the final time. The cheering's faded since. Once he seemed a political and an electoral titan, utterly dominating British politics. Now his reputation's frayed and fraying still. Well, my guest today, the journalist Tom Bowers, published highly critical accounts of a series of powerful figures, and the former Prime Minister is his latest target. His book's called Tony Blair, The Tragedy of Power. He paints a devastating picture of what the Blair years look like from the inside. And it seems, from what your account is describing, that the principal fault that runs across most of the incidents in this book is that he was superficial. He never got into things. He didn't know stuff. And that is the thread that runs through almost all the incidents within this, was the sheer superficiality that you accuse him of.
Yes, which starts with a lack of ideology. I mean, the point about triangulation, as the way he put it, was that there actually wasn't either socialism or capitalism. It was a mixture, and he took what was best, and the whole emphasis was on sound bites. Everything was about in sort of verbless prose modernization. But in the end, who could define what Blairism was and is?
So you'd
today?
be happier with him if he'd been a Jeremy Corbyn-esque figure or a Margaret Thatcher figure, but something in between didn't work?
Well, it's not what I'm happy with. I mean, that was the reality. I mean, he won 3 elections because he appealed to all sorts of people, and the appeal is what was his strength. The problem was he got into power, and as the book shows, he didn't know then what to do with the power, and he kept on changing his mind because there were no core principles.
And the other thread that runs through so many of the incidents of this book is the extent to which the Blair years were dominated by the continually unfolding feud with Gordon Brown, which poisoned so much, in your account, within this government.
I think Brown sabotaged the government, and Blair, because of what I did find about Blair was his lack of education. He was a man who was intelligent and was clearly responsive to all sorts of ideas, but because he didn't read, because he hadn't studied history and government, he didn't know how to cope with a challenger like Brown. Now, if he'd understood how Margaret Thatcher or Bismarck or Disraeli or Gladstone had dealt with a rival, a powerful rival, he would have dispatched Brown pretty quickly and neutralized the threat. But he didn't know how to do it, and so allowed himself to be constantly hammered by a man who really didn't have the support in the Labour Party to rival Blair, but could be a nuisance and irritant, and proved to be that.
I mean, reading Broken Vows, your book here, one of the things that comes across is that a lot of your primary sources seem to be civil servants, very senior civil servants, cabinet secretaries, department heads, those kind of people. And that sounds very much like a civil servant's criticism, the kind of Olympian view of the Mandarin class, of the mere political men who come along and tell them what to do.
No, I think that's most unfair. First of all, I did talk to a lot of civil servants. I talked to a lot of generals. I talked to a lot of politicians, a lot of Blairite ministers, all the way up. What is unusual in this book is the civil servants went on the record, which is unusual. And the reason they did that is because they started off, as I say right at the end in the words of Richard Wilson, they started with great hope. They really did believe that after the terrible major years, this was going to be the new dawn. And they were disappointed. And what they tell is the reasons for their disappointment. So I don't think it's disgruntlement, and it's certainly not partial. These are people who had dedicated their lives to public service and wanted to do the best for Britain and for the government. And they were defeated because they were working for a man and for a group of people like Alistair Campbell and the rest who actually didn't understand how to run government.
I mean, the book contains account after account of new cabinet minister arrives in department for the first time, is presented with great sort of dossiers on how to implement their manifesto presentations by the civil servant, and immediately just either sort of shoves it aside with disdain or demands a couple of sides of A4.
Well, I think this all starts really, first of all, because Tony Blair does not understand government, and when Robin Butler, his first cabinet secretary, tried to explain to him how it works, he pushed Butler away, so that Blair at the end of his career says, I kept on pulling on the levers of power and nothing happened. Well, that was his own fault. The second villain in all this responsible is Jonathan Powell, his chief of staff, who had enormous contempt and distrust of civil servants, or they'd been from his previous experiences in the Foreign Office, and that coloured Blair's own approach. And so they all arrived, the ministers, and continued with great suspicion that the civil servants, having worked for 18 years for the Tories, were all Tories. Well, they weren't. They were civil servants, and many of them were pro-Labour and wanted to work.
Maybe they were suspicious of people who thought, fresh from their triumphs in the major years, do they really know what they're doing anyway?
Well, no, I don't think that's right at all. I spoke to them all. I didn't have that feeling at all. What I had was the feeling of a government that arrived which didn't know what it wanted to do. I tell that, for example, in the nature of the conversation on the 3rd of May 1997 between Alan Milburn, the junior health minister just appointed, and Blair. And Milburn says to Blair, "What shall I do?" And Blair replies, "We need a health policy." Well, I mean, anyone who experienced the 97 election with 24 hours to save the NHS wouldn't have believed that possible. But that went right through not only health but education to some extent, but more on immigration, more on wars and things that we might get into. But it was very frustrating for the civil servants who had put so much effort in trying to help Labour implement its manifesto, and to their surprise discovered Blair and all the others cascading on saying, "Don't worry about the manifesto, we've got other things in mind."
But this got them, in your account, into endless trouble. The account, for example, you'd be talking about health, you'd be talking about immigration, but let's talk about education policy for a moment. The description of Blair bouncing between the Chief Inspector of Schools, Chris Woodhead, the Permanent Secretary of the Department of Education, the demands of his ministers, what was appearing in the papers about educational standards, and trying this, trying that, grasping for a solution, is actually quite devastating.
Well, it is, and I think that's what has annoyed the Blairites so much. That's why I've got so much criticism. That if you listen to the Blairite spin, the Campbell perfect prose, the narrative is only of unbelievable success in education, because after all that was the priority. The reality when you get to the coalface of the civil servants and the advisors is of vacillation, of targets, of everything which was counterproductive to actually implementing improvements. So you get this extraordinary discovery, which is that after 10 years of Blair government, standards had actually fallen in education. And that was because of the vacillation and constantly changing of policy. And this was one of the many, many discoveries which I made, which I did not enter into thinking I'd find this, that he entered government determined to effectively start from year zero, that what the Tories had done on the whole was wrong. And then, by about 2000, 3 years into government, discovered that the legacy was not all bad. And the Tories, through trial and error and a lot of error and a lot of pain, had discovered what would work. So, for example, in education, he abolishes 1,100 grant-maintained schools and then realizes that was a mistake and decides, well, we'll call the new ones academies. In the health system, he abolished the internal market, abolished trust hospitals and all the rest of it, and GP fund holders, and then in 2000 tells Milburn, well, we better go back to that after all. And the route back to the legacy, so to speak, the inheritance, so to speak, is what causes the pain.
And in the background, you have Gordon Brown turning on and off, as you describe, the money tap.
Exactly.
And as a political weapon.
Exactly.
Blair gets his reforms if he agrees to something else, and then the money may flow.
And always when you're going to resign. And then when you get to 2002, the attempts then to return to the inheritance of the markets and competition and choice from the Tories gets completely stymied because of Iraq. Because he then needs unity in the cabinet to push Iraq through, and some ministers like Blunkett, or more importantly Margaret Beckett, and others are going to sabotage and oppose anything from their left-wing point of view which smacks of the Tory policy, and then he's completely frustrated.
But your bill of indictment just it seems occasionally slightly selective. For example, there is no mention in there of one of the things that Blair spent an enormous amount of time on. Northern Ireland pops up 5 times in the index.
And rightly so, because for several reasons. First of all...
Right to ignore it.
Well, I didn't ignore it. The book is about the 5 areas where money was spent. Billions and billions were misspent on wars, education, health, energy and immigration. The public was never concerned really about the peace process in Ireland. And of course it was a success.
Would have been if it had gone wrong.
Well, I agree, but it didn't go wrong. And it's not a contentious subject. And if you're interested in Blair and Ireland, there are about a dozen books about it. I had nothing new to add about Ireland. And it's very interesting that that's the one area which the Blairites decided to focus their criticism. That was their mission, because they couldn't criticize health, education and the other things. And I deliberately didn't want to. I mean, the book is long enough. Interested in Ireland, there are other books on Ireland. Interested in, rambling, there are books on rambling. This is a book about the waste of money and a wasted opportunity, and Ireland was not that. And I must tell you, of course, Blair...
So you deserve credit for that?
Of course he does. But it isn't just Blair. He was in office 1 year when the Good Friday Agreement came up. John Major had achieved an enormous amount. The IRA crumbled into the Good Friday Agreement because of the success of the intelligence services undermining and debilitating the IRA. It was a huge effort for many years before. So, of course, he deserves credit, but others too. He, however, was entirely responsible for these 5 areas: health, education, energy, immigration, and the wars. And on that, I focus, because on that he claims success, and he doesn't deserve that success to be unchallenged.
I just wanted to touch a little bit on life after the premiership for Tony Blair, because you open the book with again, a fairly sort of devastating account of him jetting into a third world country and the blurring of lines between charitable endeavour and commercial dealing that goes on in there. How important a facet of Tony Blair is that for you?
Well, I think it's very important for one crucial issue, and this is what the Blairites cannot grapple with. They can't understand why Tony Blair has got himself involved with these dictatorships and shady regimes and commercial deals. Now, the question which the Blairites cannot answer, to their dismay, is which is the real Tony Blair? Was Tony Blair that opportunistic money-grabbing man in government, or did he suddenly change in June 2007? And that is the question they can't answer, because I don't believe that he suddenly changed. I think he was always interested in money, and the examples I give of his relationship with Bernie Ecclestone and Jeffrey Robinson and others during his period in government suggest that was a consistent theme. It's just that he was bursting with anger during his period of the premiership that he didn't have enough money. And that, of course, was encouraged by Cherie for her own reasons. And that is something which is pretty unexplained, and he doesn't want to explain it.
You've taken an awful lot of comeback from the Blairites. Is there anything in this book you retract from? No.
In fact, I wish I'd gone even further in some regards. I mean, what is remarkable is, in all this, that here we have a man who dominated our lives and set the seal for our country for years to come.
And you're basically saying he fooled us all almost all the time.
I'm saying he fooled us, but I don't think from malicious reasons. I don't think he's an evil man. I think he's an uneducated man. And what you've really got is a group of people who served him, who for various reasons cannot accept that their judgment during the period of government and their judgment of man they knew so well was faulty, because it's very difficult for someone to admit a mistake.
There's an old proverb in politics that there are 2 things you should never allow people to see being made, and they are laws and sausages, and the pretty revolting things go into both processes. Is it not the case that you could write something similar about an awful lot of governments, an awful lot of prime ministers, an awful lot of discreditable personal manoeuvring and grubbing for an advantage going on in almost every administration since the dawn of time? You know, King Arthur's court probably had it.
Yes, there is. And what's interesting is, when it came to Margaret Thatcher or Harold Wilson, and probably before your time, I don't remember, even with Harold Macmillan, that was all written, both during his time and immediately after. Blair has enjoyed a huge honeymoon period because no one wanted to take him on and go to the source, the coalface, i.e. the people who actually worked in the ministries, the departments, whether the civil servants, the junior or the senior ministers, and especially the generals, because we haven't talked about the wars. We know Afghanistan was a terrible, terrible war to embark on. And no one has actually gone into that. And this is the first time anyone has told the story from the inside, using inside sources, and most importantly, which irritates the Blairites so much, from quoted civil servants and quoted ministers. That is what's so unusual.
Well, it's a fascinating account of a very different account of the Blair premiership. We look forward to your next book. Tom Blair, thanks for joining us on Book Talk.
Thank you.
And Book Talk will be back again next week. Do join us then.